The topic is an important one for anyone who cares about American competitiveness in the financial services sector, a financial ecosystem that empowers users over bank CEOs and other powerful central decision makers, and the next iteration of the internet in which individuals are able not only to read information and write content, but also to own a piece of the networks themselves. So the characteristic of Web 1, if people remember their original AOL account, was an ability to look in a curated walled garden at a set of content that was not interactive, but was presented to you on AOL the way that Time magazine used to show you the articles they wanted you to see inside of their magazine. Just you could see it on a screen. The innovation of Web 2 was that suddenly you could not only read content, but you could also write content. This is when the blogosphere became a big thing. People remember this from the late 90s, the early 2000s. The reason for the centralization of the internet, of course, was that all of that activity was being monetized by a very small number of companies. Facebook, as the chairwoman mentions, Google, and 2 or 3 other companies. What makes Web 3 different is the ability to own the actual network. And that's what crypto assets themselves represent, is an ownership stake in an underlying network. So when you hear people talk about, for example, layer 1 tokens, what they mean is this is your reward for providing the ledger maintenance services, the computing power to the network that on Web 1 and 2 was done by Google, right? So now people in my hometown of Pueblo, Colorado can actually own the Ethereum network, but they can't own the internet. That's owned by Google and a few other companies. That's what the project of crypto is all about, is allowing people to directly own the networks that have native assets that are supporting it, and that's the nature of decentralization, where the token holders are the people who control the asset, not
so
Google.
Token holders, for our language here on the Hill, those are digital assets, right? Which are the keys to open up the ledger for you to participate, right?
Correct.
So describe to us how those digital assets fit into this internet revolution, Web 3.
So the concept is that you have sort of application layer tokens and you have protocol layer tokens. So if I'm an owner of Bitcoin, let's say that I'm a miner of Bitcoin, somebody who actually creates Bitcoin. The Bitcoin is the reward I receive for doing the work to keep the network operational, and that allows me to own a piece of the Bitcoin blockchain. Or take Ethereum, which is easier to understand. The Ether token represents an ownership stake in the network, but on top of that network are all kinds of apps that get built on the network, much like the apps on your phone depend on the underlying network existing that lets the phone operate. And so people will make judgments about which network is likely to win, and they will invest in the tokens in that network much the same way you might invest in Google stock because you think Google is going to scale access to the original internet. The difference being here, you can vote on what happens in the future of a proof of stake network, for example. You can get rewarded through a proof of work token for maintaining a ledger on something like Bitcoin. But the real message here is that what happens on the decentralized internet is decided by the investors, versus what happens on the main internet is decided by Twitter, Facebook, Google, and a small number of others.
This doesn't seem like a new financial system per se, but really an extension or perhaps expansion of our present one.
Well, I would disagree with that. I think what I believe we're seeing is a new open infrastructure layer on the internet, a missing infrastructure layer of the internet that is designed around value exchange and economic coordination, that is rooted in immutable data, the ability to interact with counterparties in a very, very safe way that hasn't existed before on the internet. And really, many of the efficiencies that the internet brings in terms of moving information brought into moving value, but also with greater degrees of security than are often offered through the existing financial system. So I really do believe we're building a new global economic infrastructure layer.
In your view, is additional guidance defining clear rules of the road for investors and market participants needed at this time?
Thank you for the question. We believe this is a very important area of focus for the SEC and this committee. We do agree that the laws are clear. However, existing laws, regulation, and legal precedent make it clear that blockchain tokens are not securities. So we believe that the law clearly shows that blockchain-based digital assets are one of two things, either a new form of digital property or a new way to record ownership, as Brian Brooks spoke earlier about. We do believe that clarity is needed because these are new assets. It's a new way of transacting with these new protocols that we spoke about, and I think it would benefit all of us in the ecosystem to have agreed upon definitions.
I think from the standpoint of what's available in the market today, one of the things that we need to do better in this industry, and I think we're working in that direction, is much like the early days of the web, we need to focus on consumer-oriented products that have a lot of information about the challenges and also brings the person through from a literacy standpoint. So they understand, you look at user experience, you look at UX design, all of these things are really, really important. And as we saw in the early days of the web, it happened, it came together. We became better at educating the audience about what's available and what's out there. The nice thing about blockchain is you have immutability, you have records that are out there that can't be changed. This information is already leveraged by Chainalysis, for example, in Elliptic, to demonstrate the different things that are happening on chain. And I think it allows us the opportunity to create a lot more foundational efforts with respect to user experience and focus on these consumer protection issues that you're talking about.
One of the really innovative properties of cryptocurrency markets are 24/7 risk monitoring engines. We do not have overnight risk or weekend risk or holiday risk in the same way traditional assets do, which allow risk monitoring and de-risking of positions in real time to help mitigate volatility. We've been operating for a number of years with billions of dollars of open interest. We've never had customer losses, clawbacks, or anything like that, even going through periods of large movements in both directions. We store collateral from our users in a way which is not always done in the traditional financial ecosystem to backstop positions. And the last thing that I'll say is if you look at what precipitated some of the 2008 financial crisis, you saw a number of bilateral, bespoke, non-reported transactions happening between financial counterparties, which then got repackaged and re-leveraged again and again and again, such that no one knew how much risk was in that system until it all fell apart. If you compare that to what happens on FTX or other major cryptocurrency venues today, there's complete transparency about the full open interest. There's complete transparency about the positions that are held. There's a robust, consistent risk framework applied, and we're excited to work with the CFTC on our U.S. licensed and regulated venue to bring a lot of this to U.S. customers as well.
As digital assets become more common in the global marketplace, with the total digital asset market reaching almost $3 trillion, as Ranking Member McHenry just said, how do we ensure the U.S. dollar remains the reserve currency?
One is, if we start with stable coins before we talk about other crypto assets, I've said for a long time that the secular reduction in dollar holdings as a percentage of global central bank holdings is alarming. And this has been going on for more than 10 years at this point. So dollars as a share of the European Central Bank, the Japanese Central Bank, et cetera, has shrunk from 80+% to more like 60+% in a short amount of time. What that tells me is that in the future, with the rise of China and other major economies, the US dollar can't take its primacy for granted, and we need to start thinking about competing on utility, on features, not just based on a post-World War II monetary system that we could take for granted for the last 2 generations. And that's one of the reasons that I've been such a supporter of internet-enabled dollars, which allow us to compete on features, not only on history. I think that's really critically important. The second thing I would tell you is, as we enter year 11 or 12 of a highly inflationary environment, after all, we've been printing enormous numbers of new dollars since the financial crisis, there will come a time, gradually then suddenly, when the attractiveness of the dollar relative to other currencies could change. One of the benefits of the crypto economy is that it creates some counter incentives on the part of the Fed to do that kind of policy, because people will flee to other kinds of assets. And that sort of market competition is something that I think will ultimately shore up our monetary policy and keep the dollar where it rightfully ought to be, which is as the dominant reserve currency it's been for all of our lives.
Can you talk about some of the negative consequences that could happen if we take a heavy-handed approach to regulating this developing technology?
Well, I come back to Mr. Vargas's question a second ago, which I think is the right way to answer your question. You know, Mr. Vargas asked the question of people have the potential to lose a lot of money. These things are volatile, they're risky. How do we protect them from those kinds of issues? There are 2 ways of answering that. One is to prevent as many people as possible from accessing this amazing technology. For example, the way the current legal regime works is certain kinds of assets can only be purchased by accredited investors, meaning rich people. So the only people who can get rich on this are people who are already rich. That'd be one way of protecting people from losing money, is to make sure that only the richest can access it. Another way of addressing it would be to make it safer the way that we made equities safer 40 years ago, right? We created mutual funds, diversification, sector funds, and other things that make it easier for regular Americans from places like my hometown in Colorado to buy equities without having to be stock experts. Strangely, in the US, we've refused to do that so far. So we don't allow crypto mutual funds. We don't allow people to diversify the way that they do in Canada, Germany, Singapore, the United Arab Emirates, and a series of other regulated economies around the world. So I would argue the way to win is to bring more people into the system more safely, not to keep them out at their own peril.